Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us this afternoon for the virtual interviewing session with Saqi Mehta. Before I get going, if I could just ask all of you to mute yourselves, that would be fantastic. And then at the end of the more formal component of the presentation, I will begin sharing with Saqi the questions that you all shared with us prior to today's talk. But for those of you who maybe didn't have a time or a moment to write in a question, you'll then be given the opportunity to unmute yourself and voice your question. All right. So without further ado, I'm going to turn things over to Saqi Mehta. And perhaps, Saqi, before you jump off into today's topic, if you could just share with the group today a little bit about your career journey.
Sure. Yeah. Hi, everyone. Good morning for me. I'm based out of San Francisco. My name is Saqi Mehta, and I currently lead the early talent and university recruiting team at Cloudera, which is a tech company that's headquartered in the Bay Area. But my background has been in higher education as well as recruiting. I actually worked with Shannon and Susanna and Misha. Hi, Misha. At Tufts for a few years, and then left in 2018, last year, 2019, to come to the Bay Area and be immersed in tech. So prior to that, I've been at a couple of other companies, Disney, Square, VMware. So yeah, I love early talent, university settings, meeting with students, and just passionate about all things around career education and employment. So I'm happy to answer any questions. I have some slides that I put together that I'll share right now. Okay. Can you see my screen okay?
Yes, Saqi.
Okay, perfect. Awesome. So yeah, we're talking about virtual interviews. So what makes up a good virtual interviews? And I should give you a little bit of insight perhaps to our process at Cloudera, because we are like a remote company. We actually do a lot of virtual interviews and have used Zoom for a while prior to COVID and, lockdown basically happening. So it's been something we've been doing for a while. And I know a number of companies, particularly tech companies, have also been utilizing. But in terms of what makes them really unique right now, it's really an opportunity for an interviewer to see your personality and really get to know you a bit more, as much as you can, without really meeting in person. An opportunity to pick up on nonverbal cues. So I would say at the end of the day, you want to treat a virtual interview pretty much the same as any other in-person interview. I think the advantage is that you can be even more prepared. You can have notes. For the most part, you're seeing this little square, right? So you can have notes. You can basically have like a cheat sheet of things that you want to say, of course, in addition to your resume. It forces the interviewer to focus on you. So sometimes when you're like in an in-person situation, people get distracted, or someone might accidentally come in to talk to them, or they may just be looking around. But really, when you're in this kind of a Zoom session, you really are looking at someone face to face, and you don't really have a lot of other things going on. So that's definitely an advantage. As I mentioned, you can use your own cheat sheets. It saves you travel time, right? No cost. It really is nice, because then you can do it more on your terms, in terms of like what setup, makes you comfortable, your space, and we'll get into those a little bit. And then you have a faster ability to speak to more people at the company. So unlike an in-person interview where you may have to align with schedules, and sometimes it's hard to get different people in one room for the day that you may be coming on site. This way, anyone can join from anywhere with any different time zone. So all of that equivocates it essentially. So in terms of preparation and setting yourself up for success, there's a couple of different things I would recommend. So in terms of just your physical setting, just making sure you're comfortable is really, really important, right? So you may have a desk, you may be sitting on your bed, you may be on the floor, whatever setup works for you. I think that's fine. Just make sure that, you are like seated upright, that you're comfortable. Again, treating it just as if you were speaking to someone in person. Lighting, I think, is important, whether you have like natural light being near a window, or if you need a lamp, perhaps it's evening, or you just don't have a lot of natural light in your space. Just again, making sure and testing out all of these things to make sure that you're comfortable ahead of time. And then sound, like definitely minimizing distractions. So sometimes I have like little AirPods, so I'll put them in if I feel like I need to really listen closely to something. Otherwise, I personally am comfortable with just the ambient noise with my laptop. But if you have roommates or family, just letting them know ahead of time what's going on. So even as simple as like texting other people and saying, hey, I'm going to be on this call or interview. Please just like, if you can keep it down, that would be great. That can go a long way too, especially during an interview when you're trying to put your best foot forward. In terms of technology, most computers these days, I think, are built in with a webcam. But if you don't have one, just making sure that you have one and access, making sure that it's clear, just like cleaning it. It's an angle that you feel comfortable with. And if you don't have a webcam or have access, you can always ask your interviewer and they can potentially mail you one as well. In terms of the background, so this is actually not my like real home. I just created like a virtual Zoom background, which I like. So you can have just like different ones, I would say, as long as it's pretty professional. Again, especially for an interview, that would be great. And then internet, just making sure your connectivity is good, your Wi-Fi set up. The little things really do go a long way. And then just knowing yourself. So in terms of your resume reviews, you're attending sessions like this, which is definitely helpful. I know there's people on staff like Shannon who can help you just, with your resume, and there's other career staff who can just make sure that like, is it really set up for success? At the same time that you are having an interview, that means that your resume most likely has been looked at by the people who are interviewing you. So just going through it, making sure that you have examples to draw from based on the questions they're going to ask you would be great. Researching the company as well. And this is no different than if it was in person, but it's always a two-way street, right? Of course, when you're interviewing, you want to do your best job, but you should also know that you are interviewing the company. So making sure that that you feel comfortable and can ask questions to them as well. And then having questions, just, you can write down things that you'd want to ask. And if you do have a schedule where you have multiple people interviewing you, perhaps writing down like different questions that you could ask to different folks so that you're not, constantly repeating yourself, or just have different ideas of what you want. Also, because it's a Zoom interview, you can take notes, right, during the interview. So if someone says something that's really pertinent to something you're thinking of, or just something that surprised you or you liked, you could write that down. And when you send a thank you note after, it's just easier to remember. Like I personally, when I do an interview, you're talking so much, and usually it's in person, so it's harder to remember those kinds of things. But this gives you that opportunity as well. Practicing, I think, is just, a key, just like anything else, especially since this is a little bit more of an unnatural environment. So, whether it's your classmates, or I'm guessing that most of you have a lot of Zoom meetings that are happening right now anyway. So you can take that opportunity to practice ahead of time. There's lots of great like questions online that you could even just give to like a friend or family member and say, hey, can you just ask me these and run through, and just practice a few times, perhaps even record yourself, which you can do on Zoom, play it back, and then just see, how comfortable you feel, and especially in terms of like content. So I just pulled up like some sample questions. So these could be asked to you, like, why are you interested in this position? What do you know about our company? I feel like people don't love to ask about weaknesses. It's more like, what are points of opportunity? What are areas that you can improve on? So you've probably heard this before, but you always want to turn like a weakness into a strength as much as possible. What do you consider to be your biggest professional achievements? Or since you're in school, it could be around things that you've done at Tufts. Tell me about a challenge at work and how you best dealt with it. This could also be a challenge with school, like a project you've worked on, maybe like an extracurricular you're part of, anything like that. What are you looking for in this particular position? And the why are you leaving your current role is probably more pertinent for those who are in industry. But those are just some samples. And then you could ask, what does like a typical day look like? What are the company's goals? What's like an ideal candidate for this position? And then what are like the next steps in the hiring process? Given that we are mostly remote now, I think it's fair to ask, like, what does it look like in the future for this particular internship? So for example, if you were to interview tomorrow for a position, you could say, okay, well, for the rest of the summer, perhaps this could be remote, but then what happens like as things start to open up? Does it continue to be remote? Would I potentially have to go into an office? So the nice thing is that if you currently are, in one state and your position was going to be located like in New York, for example, and you're in Boston, you may have a better ability to do that. And now, of course, you don't have to worry so much about relocating or cost of housing and, all of those things too. So as I've mentioned, I would say treat it exactly the same. You want to dress the part. My general advice is like wearing a full-on suit, I don't think is always necessary, and it depends on the industry that you're in. But I would say just kind of dress one level up from what you may normally, consider casual, or just making a good impression, right? Like right now, you're not seeing a lot of people's clothing, frankly. So just as long as it's kind of well groomed and you feel good about it. Watching your body language is important. So making eye contact with the person you're speaking with. I think that's really, and just, kind of acknowledging things that they're saying, whether it's like a slight nod or just an acknowledgement of what's being said. And you can also watch how the interviewer is responding to what you are saying as well. And most importantly, just be yourself. Don't feel like you have to do anything super extra just because it's virtual. It pretty much is the same. And then not forgetting to follow up. So I think it's interesting that, for example, like when I used to go to career fairs, I would meet like, say 200 people, but then only 10 may send me like an email to follow up, and even fewer are asking for my email, right? So you can always ask for that. Or if you don't feel comfortable from your recruiter or the person who set up your interview, you could just say, hey, I would love to send this note, and then just put in the email, like the thank you note, and then say, can you just send this to everyone that I met with today? So there's multiple ways of doing that, but just at least one would be great, just as a small gesture, and it does like go a long way. And as I mentioned, like if there was something that really stuck out to you, you could write that down like during the Zoom or right after, and use that as part of the note of like, oh, when Susie said this, this really stood out to me and I would love to be part of XYZ. So yeah, those were the notes I had, but I'm happy to answer additional questions.
So Saqi, thank you so much. We actually received quite a few questions, so perhaps I'll just try to get through as many as possible based on our time, and then we'll see where we're at. How does that sound?
Yeah, perfect.
Great. So the first question that came in was how to appear confident during an interview.
I think listening is really important, right? So of course you're trying to make the best impression possible, but little things like waiting until the person you're corresponding with has finished speaking before you answer, trying not to jump in, trying not to be too distracted, just really active listening, I think is a big part of it. And as I mentioned, like eye contact and just kind of acknowledging what someone's saying. I think that's really the best way.
Great. What would be your recommendations for how to conquer interviewing fears?
I think practicing really, like anything else. So I don't know if you've heard of Malcolm Gladwell. He's a writer and he's kind of like a historian and like a data scientist, multiple things put into one. So he has this line in one of his early books and research that has the concept of 10,000 hours, that in order to be like an expert in something, you have to have done something for 10,000 hours. And, you know, that's a long time, right? So my point in saying that is like doing the same thing like over and over and over is really the only way that you get to a point where you really consider yourself confident and an expert. So just practicing and really just making sure you know yourself in terms of your resume, for example, not only reviewing it prior to an interview, but what I used to do is just kind of like extract different pieces of information, and I would have like notes on the side of like my computer, right? And I would write, okay, well, you know, if they ask about a difficult situation I had to go through, I'm going to point to XYZ experience, and then here are some quick bullet points that I'm going to say. Or if they're you, you know, what do you see for yourself in 5 years? You know, just kind of thinking through what these questions may be. And you can literally just have like notes all over your computer. You can have a notebook and just spread it out in a way, and even just like write or type it out really large so it's easy to read and you're not like squinting while you're talking to someone. But yeah, just practicing and having your notes ready, which you can now do, would be pretty helpful.
And the other thing I'll just add to that, Saqi, is for those of you, just please know that you can always schedule an appointment with the Career Center to specifically request a mock interview. And now, being that we are doing remote, I always say let's try to simulate what your interviewing experience is going to be as close as possible. But now, you know, we're doing all of our appointments through Zoom. So in a way, we're able to closely simulate what that experience is going to be like. So I would encourage you all to do that. And also to check out Big Interview, which is a resource on our website for you to, there's all different sets of questions for different industries, even if you're going on to graduate school. There's kind of a module for medical school and law school with a list of questions where you can answer them and record and then get feedback. Should I point things out on my resume or assume they've read it?
I think you could probably ascertain that early on. Like usually a person interviewing you will be like, oh, well, so I saw your resume. Either they walk in with your resume in hand or on Zoom, and we'll mention that of like, oh, I've had a chance to look at your resume. So usually they lead with that. But even if they don't, I think it's totally fine to point things out on your resume. In fact, and you don't necessarily have to say like, oh, well, if you look at my resume, you know, at this point I mention XYZ. I think you can just speak to it in your answers. And, you know, when you summarize perhaps a little bit about yourself, that's really an opportunity to summarize your resume, but also giving examples through work that you've done. So it's not, an interview is not really to just kind of say, oh yeah, well, you know, I was here at this company, or I interned here, or this is, you know, what I took in school. But I think it's more through the power of storytelling and narrative and giving examples. And that really drives your point home, and it makes the interviewer also remember you, because it's like, oh, okay, you know, this person not only was at this company or did this project, but like this is what they achieved. So focusing on the results, focusing on your individual contribution is really important too.
Thanks, Saqi. So as we know, it can depend from one interview in one company to the next, but generally you're going to be interviewing with more than one person. And so with that said, the question is, I'm meeting with someone from human resources. How should that interview differ than if I'm speaking to my future supervisor?
Yeah, that's a great question. I usually like your HR person is like either your recruiter, so they're the one who's kind of like ushering you through the process. And at the end of the day, probably giving you like your offer letter or just walking you through the details of the internship or job. So with them, I think you can ask more of the logistical questions, right? Things like, oh, what does the future of this job look like? Is it going to be remote or in person? You know, things like compensation or salary. really the hiring manager or the other interviewers are going to be the people that you talk more content with. So what exactly your job is day to day, you know, what, how your success will be measured, performance expectations, all of the content of the job itself would be with interviewers, and then HR or recruiting would be more just logistical.
Thank you. So this is kind of a very specific question, but when doing a virtual interview, is it important to look at the camera, or is it okay to look at the screen when you're interviewing?
Oh, I see. Yeah, I think either is fine. I tend to look just like straight into the screen and not at the camera, and I think that's okay. Again, whatever you're comfortable with, I don't think that'll make a huge difference. But I think most people tend to just kind of look straight and more at like the face of the person you're talking to. So that's fine.
What would be your recommendation or advice in terms of what is the best impression one can make in a virtual meeting? In other words, how can a virtual interview work to our benefit? And I feel like you touched upon that in your presentation, but perhaps if there's other things you'd like to add.
Yeah. What else could I say? I mean, I think even just so in person, usually, you know, you have some like chit chat and just things that you were talking about before your quote unquote official interview starts. And so I will say, like, so I have a lot of meetings now with people, and I work at a global company, so I'm meeting with people from literally like around the world. They can be in Budapest, in India, here. So it's just a nice opportunity. I use the first 5 minutes just to get to know someone a little bit of like, oh hi, like I noticed you're located here. How are, you know, even in light of COVID, right? I'd be like, oh, so how are things going with you? And I spoke with someone from India last night. How is it going in India, in Bangalore with COVID? What is lockdown looking like? You know, and just hearing from different folks. We're all honestly going through the same thing right now. I think we're all kind of at somewhat of the same emotional baseline. So in a way, it equivocates it, right? And it makes it easier to have certain conversations. So I would, you know, whether it's that, of course, or just anything, maybe if you can look them up ahead of time, if you have a sense of who you're going to be interviewing with, you can even ask your recruiter or, you know, whoever set up the interview, who that is. And I try to do that when I've had interviews in the past. And then I look them up on LinkedIn just so I get a sense of who they are. And sometimes there might be something interesting that I notice that I could, or, you know, bring up with. So like I'm from Maryland, and if I notice that someone's from there, I'm like, oh, I noticed you went to the University of Maryland. I'm from Maryland, or, you know, whatever that looks like. It makes you memorable no matter what, just because it's like, oh, okay, there was something small, you know. It doesn't even have to be an intro researching someone ahead of time. You could just make small talk, you know, about anything really, or, you know, be funny, whatever is comfortable for you.
Thanks, Saqi. And you touched upon this, but perhaps if there's anything else you'd like to add in terms of whether or not you would recommend dressing up formally like you would if you're going to an in-person interview.
Yeah, I think it's really just like, you know, this up, like as long as you have a nice, you know, shirt or clothing on that you feel it presents whatever makes you comfortable and presents your best foot forward, right? I wouldn't want you to wear something that you're not used to. I don't think really you have to wear a suit, even if it's like a finance, you know, type of role. It's more just about being presentable and comfortable, and frankly, like, so I'm a big proponent of diversity and inclusion, and like I think that also expands what that means, right? Back in the day it was more, yeah, you have to wear like a suit regardless, and I remember those days. But now I think it's like, listen, if you have like a nose ring and that's what, you know, makes you you and you feel comfortable in, you should feel free to do that. So I think it's also expanding the definition, and there's really no one right way. I would just think about like the type of industry that you're working in and what tends to be, you know, the norm or appropriate there.
Thanks. And the only thing I'll add to that, Saqi, is actually like further reiterating it, just being comfortable. But also, and this is just me on a personal level, but every day, you know, I do put fresh clothes on, you know, and I think too, it's creating that mindset that you feel is going to allow you to kind of get into game position. And so like today I put on a little mascara and lipstick, like it makes me feel just like, you know, so I guess too, coming back to being comfortable, but then also, yeah, like what it takes for you to kind of feel like you're ready to kind of, be in game mode. And perhaps, and for me, sometimes, part of that has become my daily routine, because I feel like if I don't kind of put on those fresh clothes and kind of feel for me like I'm going to work, sometimes I don't feel like I'm in like that work frame of mind. So I guess whatever kind of helps you to get in that right.
Totally. And I'll add to that too. It's like, that's a great point, Shannon. Like, it can be very anxiety producing, right? You're kind of in this like high octane environment. You're like, I have my one shot to do things right. So for me, it's like, I feel my heart beat faster and I get nervous. I'm like sweating a little bit. So like, I literally have fans that like I'll have on me to like stay cool, right? So I'm like, whatever you need. I also am a big proponent. I know Shannon and I have talked about this, about like meditation and breathing. And so they're even just as simple as like, you breathe in for 4 counts, hold for 4 counts, and you let it out for 4 counts. That kind of activates your, I think, parasympathetic nervous system. Sorry if I'm not saying that right, but it helps like your heart rate slow down and just be calm. And so I would just, whether you do that or whether you just like sit and close your eyes for like a minute, just something to get you like mentally ready. And like the self affirmations, I think, are also important. Just, again, it's a nerve-wracking experience to say, I got this, I prepared. The fact that they're even interviewing you, it means that they've chosen you, right? And even if nothing happens after the interview, at least you've gotten to that point and you should feel very proud of yourself. So just telling yourself that and psyching yourself up, like, I have this and I'll do the best I can. And after that, it's out of my control what happens.
Love that you said that, Saqi. I love the affirmation piece. And I think that's really, really important. And whether or not you do it, outwardly and say it out loud, I got this. I've had, students back in the day when we were in the offices, sometimes I'd have them, stand up and put your arms up and say, I got this. And they felt silly, but they're like, no, okay. And I feel like whatever it takes. So I feel like you could do that. You can stand up before the Zoom call and just say, I got this. And even if you're still feeling a little bit of sweat coming on, a little bit of nervousness, I think the more you can kind of psych yourself up and is important. So thank you. Okay, so we had a few additional questions come in. Feel free to continue to send in the questions. So a question that just came in, Saqi, is someone would love to hear your perspective on what to do when we have difficulty coming up with an answer to a question.
Yeah, you can always pause and say, just give me like a couple seconds to think about it. That's totally okay. You don't have to always feel like you have something immediately on the spot to say. At the same time, I would say this is why that preparation is so important, so that you can really think through. Let's put it this way. You may not be able to always anticipate what someone is going to ask you, but you could have enough examples of different competencies and things in your mind that you draw from your resume. So, it could be something that speaks to like, a challenging situation, or something where you really excelled, or something that demonstrates a particular skill that you want to highlight. So really, again, just having those examples will really help prepare you. But even if you get stuck, that's okay. You could, if you're really stuck, you could say, do you mind if we circle back to this question? I just need a little bit more time to think through it. And perhaps the other points that we bring up will kind of spur my memory and make me think of something. So if you're really stuck, I would say either just say, can we circle back at the end? Or just say, can I just follow up with you at a later point?
Thanks, Saqi. Is there anything about phone technical interviews that you think are going to change due to the fact that most interviews will be conducted virtually with no on-site?
I think just the volume of them, perhaps. I know that most like our teams are just talking more about like standardizing processes and what does that look like. So I think it really just means you're probably going to be seeing more of them. And just going back to what Shannon was saying earlier about like stretching, Zoom fatigue is like a real thing. And so, if you have like a whole day of interviews, for example, and you're meeting with folks for like 2 to 4 hours, it is tiring, even though it seems like, well, I'm just sitting here and I'm talking to someone, but just like the level of concentration, think about it. If you're in a physical room, sometimes you're getting up to the bathroom, or you're drinking some water, or you're even looking away. But here it's like everyone's kind of like focusing on one focal point, right? So yeah, so that Zoom fatigue is real. And so it is important just to like have breaks and bake in time for you to do something, you know, whether it's the ability for you to get out and take a short walk or, you know, whatever that looks like. But in terms of what's going to change, yeah, I think it's just, this is going to become more the norm than anything.
Thank you, Saqi. I'm not sure if you can answer this, Saqi, but how do you approach case study style questions virtually?
Yeah, I've done mock interviews with students with case studies. We don't do them currently where I am, but I would say the main difference is on it might actually be easier for you to work on them virtually, just because you can have like your, you know, pad and paper, and let's just say, I don't know, the question was like, how many golf balls can fit, you know, in the town, in the city of Manhattan? I don't know. You could say, you know, you could start making assumptions, right? It's like, okay, well, I'm going to assume that Manhattan is X number of square miles and a golf ball is, you know, this size. And so if I were to, you know, do the math and just kind of talk through, but more than anything, I think it's about communication and making sure they know, like, this is your thought process. It's not about getting to the right answer at the end of the day. It's about like, how do you deduce a problem, or sorry, deduct a problem and come up with the right answer, or come up with a answer that makes sense and is fitting, given kind of how you've broken down a problem. So I think just talking through it, and you can have notes obviously and write that down. I think Zooms have like a whiteboard. I personally haven't used those, but that could be something else that maybe you are typing and like, you know, talking at the same time, to break down a problem.
Thanks, Saqi. So another question that's come in is, I know there's no single right answer, but what are some things you can ask an interviewer when they ask you, do you have any questions? I never quite feel prepared for this in the moment.
Sure. Yeah, I think the power of, so I worked at Disney a couple of jobs ago, and so the one thing that it taught me more than just being like a media entertainment company was the power of narrative. And so they had a saying there that someone somewhere in the world is having a Disney experience every second of every day. And it's like, well, how many companies can say that? Like maybe Coca-Cola, I don't know who else really. And I think the reason for that is that experience and like the magic, literally they call it, you know, the pixie dust that they give. And that goes so much back to the power of story. So hearing people's stories not only is significant to tie in like different facts and ideas together, but it also makes the interviewer feel like, oh, like you actually care about me personally, you want to get to know me, right? So hopefully through the course of an interview, they've gotten a chance to know you. So this might be your opportunity to do that in turn. So just ask, like I would usually ask folks that I'm interviewing with, like, oh, I'd love to hear about like your path, you know, to the company. How did you end up here? Maybe what's been something you found the most surprising since you've been here? And you don't have to ask about things that are only related to like the job that you specifically are interviewing for. Like, as I mentioned, I'm a big like diversity and inclusion advocate. So I would usually ask like, what efforts are the company, you know, what are they doing in that realm? I would love to be involved, or even just saying like at some point in the future, like I would love to be more involved in this way. But yeah, at the very least, I think start with the person, what are they doing? And then that'll hopefully spur some ideas from there.
Kind of the flip side to that, Saqi, is there any question or questions that you just feel, or that you've heard in the past that just kind of irk you, and that you would strongly urge our students not to ask?
So this is not a question, but one instance that happened that really stood out in my mind, and it goes again back to Disney. So I was basically I was a recruiter there and hiring interns and students to work at the company year round. So I would help, like my team would set up the interviews, and then I would hear like later on whether we wanted to like hire them or not hire them. And so this manager calls me at the very end of this interview that I had helped to set up. And so I was like, oh, that's pretty fast. They came to a decision. So I pick up the phone, and then she's like, okay, so I had the interview and I just wanted to give you some feedback. And I'm like, okay. So the student, first of all, like was super late because they like took the bus and got off at the wrong stop. And this is in Los Angeles. So, you know, it's a big place and it's hard to get around otherwise. So A, was late for the interview, and then through the course of the interview, started to reveal a lot of personal information. Basically, I don't know how they went down this road, but basically said, the student said, yeah, this has been like a really rough year for me. My girlfriend and I broke up, and then we had some issues, and then she took out a restraining order against me. And like, this is all obviously like terrible information, or terrible things that are happening to this person, but obviously not an appropriate venue to share that kind of information. So needless to say, did not get that offer, which otherwise the student, at least on paper from the resume, you know, obviously has strong credentials, and that's why we wanted to interview him to begin with. So I remember calling the student and just saying, like, you know, thank you for coming in and all of that, but just so you know, like, you don't have to reveal any real personal information. And if at the most, like, if you're concerned about something, that's what background checks are for. And I recognize that's like an extreme example, but just like not getting too personal or political, especially in the environment that we're in right now, is definitely helpful. I mean, again, you can talk about like a lot of things. I would say keep it a little bit more like surface level, but yeah, just not to go down a road that you may regret later. And just understanding that everyone is coming from different points of view and perspectives, and you never know. You can have a good connection with someone, but that doesn't mean you really know who they are or their personal views. So I would say just kind of like tread lightly in that way.
Thank you, Saqi. So another question that's come in is, how should we respond when interviewers ask about salary expectations?
Yeah, I think it's a little bit challenging, obviously, when you're in school and not having had a lot of like, not experience, but like just stuff to benchmark against. So if you have some parameters that you're thinking about, then I think you could definitely mention those. That's usually more like a recruiter question versus like a hiring manager. But, and I would say if you do put out like a specific number or a range, I would just give some context around it. So, you know, you could say, oh, based on like research I've done, and there are some ways that you can look up info. So Glassdoor is one that you probably have heard of, but you can maybe do some research into like what, you know, an entry level salary is, for example, for any given role. I know the Career Center can definitely help with that as well. But generally speaking, you could say, you know, I also am open based on, you know, what we've kind of talked about. So yeah, I would say either come with like a range of what you're thinking about, unless you really have like a specific reason or number in mind, and kind of go from there. Generally speaking, I feel like people who are interviewing you and just like recruiting teams, what happens is on the back end, they have like a range of salaries that's kind of predetermined based on like job level and description. So they're not like just coming at you with like a number without really putting some forethought into it. I would say for the most part, they've, you know, there's compensation teams that look at like market like rates and salaries and based on region and all of that. So they come to you with that knowledge as well.
Thanks, Saqi. How soon after the interview should you send a thank you follow-up note email?
I think within 24 hours is definitely ideal. No more than 48, I would say. But yeah, the sooner the better, really.
And perhaps this is kind of a personal case, but, you know, dependent upon the individual. But then after that, what do you feel is like a good threshold to wait if you don't receive a follow-up from the employer or the recruiter?
Sure. Yeah. Usually, like at least a week, like within a week, you know, someone should let you know how things are going. And a lot of times it can be that they are interviewing a number of folks. So they may say like, okay, we're just like, you may be one of the first that we met with. We're meeting a few more, and then we'll kind of make a decision. So usually what happens is the recruiter, you know, has to speak with the hiring managers and get feedback. And if there's multiple people that you're meeting with, they have to get feedback from everyone before coming to a final decision. So sometimes that does take a little bit of time on the back end. But yeah, I think a week is totally fair. And if you don't hear anything, you can just follow up with the recruiter and say, you know, can you let me know how things are going? Also, now that we've been in lockdown essentially for a few months now, what a lot of companies, like, you know, their hiring plans have either changed or shifted, or they're just having to rethink like what that looks like. So now things may take a little bit longer, unfortunately, than they would have otherwise. But I think it's fair, you know, again, at the time that you're interviewing or prior, just to ask like, what is the process? What is the timeline and next steps? Should we move forward in this role?
Thank you. So we still have time for a few more questions, so feel free to write in, or if you would like to voice your question, feel free to do so as well. Is there someone who has a question? I can't see everybody since there's a few different screens going on here. Feel free. I don't think I muted you, so if you have a question, you can unmute yourself and ask your question. Okay. Another question that came in, Saqi, is, as a freshman, I don't have much experience to talk about. Is it okay to talk about high school experiences, or should I only talk about college experiences?
Yeah, no, I think high school is great too. There's a lot of things I'm sure you've done in high school that you could mention, and you know, the person who's interviewing you, I mean, they have probably seen that you are a freshman or whatever year, you know, that you're at based on your resume or just whatever application you sent in. So that's totally fine. I would just say in the interim too, just remember if this all feels unnatural to you and just different, obviously, than like our in-person conversations and interviews, it's unnatural to the interviewer too. So don't if you do feel like awkward or just like, I don't know if this really went as well as it would have otherwise, just know like the other person is probably feeling the same way, because we're all just in such a new environment and kind of navigating our way through. So I would just say don't be too hard on yourself at the same time.
Thanks, Saqi. And I know I mentioned scheduling, you know, doing mock interviews, virtual mock interviews with the Career Center and Big Interview. But another thing to remember is the Herd, which is our new Flash mentoring platform that you all have access to. The alumni who have set up accounts in there that you can find, some of them have specifically stated that mock interview is the way that they would really like to help you. So that's also another option. Sometimes you might get too comfortable with myself or other staff in our office, so you want to then kind of take it to the next level and try someone who's kind of quote unquote kind of a stranger. So tapping into the Herd and the alumni in the Herd could be a great way to do that. Do recruiters appreciate when candidates are candid and more casual, or do they prefer a more professional disposition?
I would err on the side of being more professional, just because no matter what, this is an interview, and it's like it is a job evaluation at the end of the day. So I think, you know, once you get to know folks a little bit more, you can kind of break down those barriers. But like, to begin with, I remember in another role, like interviewing someone for a role on our team, and it required a lot of travel. And so we were talking about that, like, are you comfortable like traveling? And you know, kind of at first she's like, oh yeah, of course, but then started kind of going down this road of like just sharing a lot of personal information, and it just it just felt like, oh, you're trying to talk to me as like a girlfriend, and like I get it, and like I know we're trying to like build rapport, but like it just doesn't come across very authentic when it's in a job interview situation. So I think more than not, just always err on on the side of being more professional.
And to kind of build upon that a little bit, Saqi, when addressing recruiters and hiring managers, is it better to err on the caution in regards to how you address someone as Miss Mehta or as is it fine nowadays just to go by first name?
I think it's fine to go by first name. I would say the only exceptions usually are like faculty members or, you know, anyone with like a doctor or like PhD kind of title, but otherwise, yeah, it's fine.
Okay. Well, thank you everyone for a wonderful session this afternoon. Thank you so much, Saqi. I guess in closing, well, one, if there were any questions that weren't answered, I would really encourage you all to definitely tap into the Career Center. We're not, you know, even though we're all remote, we're still open. So I would encourage you to schedule appointments. Also, this is the beginning of our summer programming for the Career Center. We have a pretty robust schedule for the remainder of the summer. Next week, we're kicking off with the Who's Hiring Now for the East Coast, marketing your transferable skills and job search in COVID era. So I encourage you all to continue tuning in for our events. I guess in final closing, Saqi, is there any kind of last bit of advice or just a thought you'd like to share with the students?
Yeah, I think just being here and like, you know, wanting to prepare yourself and put your best foot forward, like that's really the best you can do. So I applaud you all. It's a very difficult environment, honestly, that we're in. I know this is not new for all of us, but particularly where you all are in your lives and like starting off your careers, whether it's an internship or full-time job. Obviously, this is nothing anyone anticipated. So I just, you know, I think you all are doing amazing and just keep doing it. And if anyone wants to reach me, I'm Saqi at Cloudera.com, and happy to chat further with anyone if you'd like.
Well, I'm giving air claps right now. So thank you, Saqi. Thank you again. Thank you everyone else for being here today. And we look forward to having you join us on future sessions. So be well, be safe, and take care.
Thank you.